Okay, then, this is lesson 2.2a, which means it's the first part of a two-part lesson on departure zones in Africa and the slave trade to the US. We will not be covering the departure zones just yet, but rather exploring some key facts about the transatlantic slave trade as per Learning Objective 2.2a, which is to describe the scale and geographic scope of the transatlantic slave trade. And in our next lesson, we'll look more closely at the departure zones, meaning where in Africa enslaved people were taken from. But for today, we're going to establish the scale of the slave trade, meaning how big it was and how many people it affected. So there are a lot of numbers, charts, graphs, and so on in this lesson. And we'll be looking at some maps as well as we try to describe the geographic scope of where enslaved Africans were being taken. So, first, just to explain a couple of helpful geographical terms, when we say the Americas, we're talking about the continents of North and South America and everything in between. That includes the islands of the Caribbean Sea, as well as the country of Brazil, which was the only Portuguese colony on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. We know that the Portuguese were busily colonizing Africa by the early 1500s, but their colonizing of the Americas was limited to Brazil. And the rest of South and Central America, including most of the Caribbean, was originally claimed by Spain. Pretty soon, the British would start setting up colonies further north, near where we live today, and we'll get into that in this lesson as well. The importation of enslaved laborers from Africa was much greater in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies than in the English colonies of North America. Only about 388,000 enslaved people were originally brought to what is now the United States, compared to around 12 million in Central and South America. And remember that the demand for slave labor was largely created by European planters who wanted field hands to grow cash crops like sugarcane, which they would then sell for profit. So that's the economic and geographical background for the numbers we're about to look at. The first essential knowledge piece today is about the number of Africans who were brought to the Americas. We can say a number like 12.5 million people, but that doesn't really give us the perspective we need to understand how big a deal that was. So let's look at this graph of European migration to the Americas during the same time period. Here you can see that between 1500 and 1580, about 100,000 Portuguese people migrated to the Americas. The British eventually became the biggest group of European migrants, and we see 303,000 British people come to the Americas between 1640 and 1700. But if we were to add a line to this graph showing the number of Africans who were forced to migrate to the Americas because of the slave trade, it would immediately break the graph because it was so many more people. We can even shrink this down and extend the scale into the millions, and the volume of enslaved Africans still breaks the graph. I mean, way, way off the charts. As you can see, the vast majority of people who were arriving in the Americas between the early 1500s and mid 1800s were African. It really wasn't even close. And the entire economy of the transatlantic world was supported by the forced labor of these millions of enslaved Africans. We've already seen that European slave trading in West Africa had been on the rise in the early decades of the 1500s. And you might remember that Afonso I of the Congo Kingdom requested that the practice be stopped as early as 1526. But of course, we know it actually got much worse after that. More and more enslaved people were forced across the Atlantic each year until the end of the 1700s, and the practice didn't really slow down until the 1850s, when a growing number of European countries finally began to outlaw it. In all, historians estimate that at least 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forced to endure the traumatic journey across the Atlantic. And as mentioned previously, the vast majority of those landed in the islands of the Caribbean Sea or in Brazil. The Caribbean islands and Spanish Central America saw the most arrivals, some 6.5 million people, mostly to feed the growing sugar industry or to mine precious metals like gold, silver, and copper. By contrast, a relatively small portion of enslaved Africans were brought directly to continental North America, or what is now the United States. Those who did were usually bought and sold in Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was a major port city in the early British colonies and a central hub of the slave trade. About 48% of enslaved Africans brought to North America ended up at markets like this one in Charleston. This pie chart gives us a convenient breakdown of the final destinations of the Africans brought across the Atlantic Ocean. As you can see, mainland North America makes up a tiny portion of the total, compared to a place like Brazil, which was close to half. It should be noted that all of these numbers are estimates, and you sometimes hear different figures from different sources. The College Board cites a slightly lower number of enslaved people brought to North America, which, as already mentioned, is 388,000. So we'll amend that. Unfortunately, the College Board also cites that as 5% of the total, which is interesting because 388,000 is not 5% of 12.5 million. It's more like 3%. Someone at the College Board probably should have checked their math or used a calculator, but I'll just mark this as less than 5%, and we'll give them that feedback later. The other useful thing about this chart is that it helps to identify the main European powers that were involved in the Atlantic slave trade. If you know that Brazil was a Portuguese colony, you should recognize that the Portuguese did by far the most slave trading, followed by the British, Spanish, French, and then the Dutch, who, by the way, are from a country called the Netherlands. Don't ask me why we call them Dutch, because that doesn't sound anything like Netherlands, but oh well. We can see the same information in this bar graph. And again, Portugal is the big one, followed by the UK, which is the modern name for Great Britain, and then France, the Netherlands, and Spain. There are some subtle differences between these two infographics, but the important thing for this lesson is that you know these are the 5 big slave trading countries. So that's the background on the scale and the geographic scope of the transatlantic slave trade. And in the next lesson, we'll be looking more closely at Africa and the places Africans were taken from, as well as the impact on African societies. See you then.